Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 783rd New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation featuring Sueyun Locks, Chloe Stagaman, and David Carrier. We're also thrilled to welcome poet Kelly Corinda here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. And here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and hosts. As director of the Locks Gallery since 1989, Sueyun Locks is committed to promoting the works of contemporary artists in Philadelphia, as well as presenting exhibitions of established internationally known artists. She currently serves as a trustee of the Philadelphia Art Museum, on the Directors Council of the Whitney Museum, and on the Board of Managers at Pennsylvania Hospital. David Carrier, formerly a professor of philosophy at Carnegie Mellon University and Champney Family Professor in Cleveland, has also been a lecturer in the Council of the Humanities and was a class of 1932 fellow in philosophy at Princeton. He has been a Getty Scholar and a Clark Fellow. He has lectured internationally, and his publications include A World Art History and Its Objects. Additionally, he has published numerous catalog essays and works of art criticism, and we're lucky to have him as an editor at large at the Brooklyn Rail. And Chloe Stagaman is a curator working with artists in public spaces. She is the director of programs at the Brooklyn Rail. And we're so grateful to have you all here today in conversation, and I'll pass it over to you, Chloe.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. And I first want to extend my thanks to the team at the Brooklyn Rail, who I am lucky to work with, and to Sueyun and to David. You'll notice that there's been a change in host for today. We're missing our regular Aesthetic Confessions host, Phyllis Tuckman. But David and I are stepping in on her behalf, and we hope we make her proud with the discussion that follows. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to David to set us up for the beginning of this conversation.
Thanks, Kelly. And I in turn should thank Fong, who last evening, a long time ago, gave lots of thoughts about how to proceed with this. What I want to do at the very start is something subjective, because there's a way of getting at my closest knowledge of the Locks Gallery. And I got to see it a lot because I was invited in some years ago now to write about one of the artists, Warren Rower. And this involved a couple of trips to Philadelphia and talking to Sueyun and looking at the show and so forth. But getting also just incidentally, in looking around the gallery, looking at some of the archives, getting a sense of the history of the gallery, and getting a sense of how it works. And what interested me a lot about that is, to put it in context, I mean, I identify myself at this point as a New York-based critic, which is kind of a fiction because I haven't lived there for 40 years. I mean, I live in Pittsburgh, but there isn't really any equivalent in Pittsburgh to the Locks Gallery. And indeed, I don't believe there's much equivalent to the Locks Gallery in Philadelphia. What I mean to say is that the idea of an ambitious gallery devoted to contemporary art that has the machinery of catalogs and publicity and looking seriously to museum connections, that's something that the Locks Gallery has really made it a major achievement. If they were in New York, they would be one of a small group of major galleries. But in Philadelphia, they really have an important place in the history of the city. And I think that has had a big effect about the way that the artists get seen, the way they get collected, and the whole vision of what an art world is. Now, just to say a brief note about that, and then I really want to get Sueyun to talk about this. Warren Rower, who I wrote about, was a very interesting, he's passed now, ambitious, major abstract painter. He had an interesting background, which I thought about it a lot, that he was a Mennonite. And I mean, you can hear about, we got Jews, we got Asian Americans, and so forth, but Mennonite was something that I really had to stop and think what that meant. And that turned out to be quite an interesting part of his story. It's a very Pennsylvania story because the Mennonites have communities in eastern Pennsylvania, not far from the Gallery. In any case, that got me to thinking of the distance between New York galleries and Philadelphia galleries and the distinctive role of the Locks Gallery. Now, what I thought, I mean, that's just me on a chunk of history that's somewhat arbitrary, but I thought it would be interesting at the start here if we could do something about the origins of the gallery and Sueyun and how her vision of over the past couple of decades, her vision of the gallery, of what to show, how to place the works and so forth, of how that has evolved.
Well, happy to talk about it. Should we start with the first slide?
Please.
Here's Marian Locks, who started the gallery in 1968. When she started the gallery, she had her whole career already behind. She was kind of retired and she was hanging out with the Philadelphia local artists, going to the student exhibitions at Pennsylvania Academy. And their main complaint was there were no galleries in the city to show futures Philadelphia artists. So she decided to, she must have been close to 60 or mid 50s when she started the gallery. So she opened the gallery, totally committed to community Philadelphia artists. And she was totally learning the art through her artists. And Edna Andrade, one of our main anchor artists at the time, was her kind of a silent advisor in a way. And Edna was teaching at the PCA at the time, Philadelphia College of Art. So anyway, she started in 1968. She passed away about 15 years ago. Can we go into our next slides after the Marian slides? I got in the picture around mid-80. By then I was married and I had 4 children, 4 daughters. Before that, I was teaching art at the college level in New Jersey State College, and moved to Philadelphia mid-80s and trying to raise my family at the same time, slowly getting involved. I quit teaching at that time and moved to Philadelphia, looking around where I can get involved with the art. And I joined the Moore College of Art board shortly after. So I'm learning, I'm keeping my eye on the art schools in the city and trying to learn the business where Marian was running at the time. She was kind of thinking about either passing it on or closing it and debating. So I sat through the gallery first few years while I have this little children running around. That was the time the Mac computer was just starting in. And I walked into Marian's office with my first Mac computer, set it down, and Marian basically said, I have nothing to do with that. Just put it away on the other corner, kind of thing. That's how we started in the mid-80s. So the very beginning of the gallery, I basically understood what Marian had done. And the next chapter of the gallery, what could I possibly do differently from there or enlarge our audience? So we had decided to invite a couple of curators and writers to get involved and give us some of their ideas. One of the early person that we engaged in a show was Rob Storr, curated a show for us in 1986. It's called Purest Image. At the time of, everybody was talking about minimalist shows. And so 86, that was a pretty ambitious, that was my first catalog for the gallery with the Rob Storr's essay and, artists like George Shapiro, Dorothea Rothburn. I think Dorothea was the only woman artist, maybe, and the rest of them are all. Ralph Humphrey was another one. I'm just, my memory is fading, but anyway, so that show was pretty impressive. So, kind of in the beginning, I was thinking we wanted to make the gallery a little bit broader than just a Philadelphia audience. We debated the idea, should we open the gallery in New York and do it here? And at the end, we have decided it's probably better to just stay in Philadelphia and build a program. So I moved the gallery. So go back to that one slide of the new gallery space. That was 1989. We moved the gallery to basically around the corner from my house, so I could be close to my children and also still run the gallery. And just, you know, the timing was good. The building became available, so we moved the gallery, much bigger space. So the first commitment I made it to the business was basically having big space. And the next thing was that wanted to do the catalogs for every exhibition. Just being in Philadelphia is very different than being in New York. We don't have walk-in traffic that New York City has. So how do you build the audience sitting in Philadelphia, still do, you know, show that matters to everybody, not just only Philadelphia audience or the New York artist groups. And that's how we started. So that's the beginning of our exhibition pro. In the beginning, I had no idea, you know, where to even go. So inviting these people and that people. So we did that Purist Image show, the Rob Store, and then I did the Robert Motherwell show in the 80s, the Louis Nevelson shows. A lot of sculpture shows I did in a way, because I came from a sculpture background. I knew a lot of sculptors. So, you know, I did the George Siegel shows, just kind of, you know, meeting a lot of artists who are active at the time, 80s and 90s. And it didn't happen till, you know, not mid 90s, probably. I started to focus on more of a specific artist that I get connected, people like Jennifer Bartlett. Although my first show was beginning of the 90s, I put her in a group shows, I met her. So kind of realized that the gallery representing the artist is also a relationship. You kind of trusting each other, your artist and you, and putting yourself in there in your entire energy and everything else. So you have to have your artist commitment as well as my commitment. So it sort of slowly started to focus a little bit into the artist that I was committing to, versus 80s kind of putting anybody who's out there has a broader audience. It was a goal in the beginning, and then sort of working on the catalogs and meeting the writers and talking to the museums, and realize that I can only do the artists that I could actually do something with and make a difference. As something that New York's not offering. I'm not in New York. And, you know, I just kind of noticed right away, we're very different sitting here in Philadelphia, although we're only 90 miles away from New York City. Like you know, my Marian used to always say, 90 miles to New York, but 900 miles from New York City. For people to come down to New York as if they're going to some overseas, it was a big deal to come down. So that had changed over the years, but focus was, how do we bring the New York world to us a little bit closer and pay attention to what we're doing. And the first thing that I had to do was, you know, talking to the artists. They are the ones who was going to bring the audience to Philadelphia. They're the ones who's going to connect it to the Philadelphia artists and Philadelphia Museum, Philadelphia arts audiences. So combining the art in New York with the Philadelphia art scene was from the beginning, it was my focus. And, you know, not necessarily I knew exactly what I was doing, but just gradually we get there where we got there, right? So representing artists like, in the beginning, I worked with the Paula Cooper a lot, representing some of the Jennifer Bartlett, Linda Benglis, those artists. And then eventually, you know, meeting other artists through artists, met Pat Steer, you know, Joanna Pusadar, all these artists are, you know, based in New York, but they were all coming to our openings and meeting our people here. So it made a bridge to getting some attention, I guess, but we're still in Philadelphia.
I'll jump in here with a question sort of about the slides that precede this one about the purest image. I was reading the foreword to the catalog for the purest image, and the opening line is, the proliferation of people making art multiplies furiously, and right behind their proliferation, the trends and isms and waves and neos tumble one after another, in many cases superficial and transient. And I wonder sort of about this idea of seriousness that came out of that show. And the space itself evokes a very a commitment and a seriousness as well. And so I wondered if you could speak a bit about that.
Actually, this show was in our old space. Marion's old space was most central to the city on Walnut Street. The second floor gallery space. Space itself was nice once you're up there. But entry was very narrow staircase, so you had to come up. And I remember Jackie Windsor's piece that we had brought in wouldn't even fit into the doorway. So we couldn't even bring it up. So right away, I realized our limits being on that second floor. And I basically, you know, I was teaching art. I was an artist myself, interested in, you know, what was going on at the time, but I had no idea where the gallery was going to go. And here I was sitting with Marion, kind of listening to her about her thoughts, how she started, and thinking, you know, what am I really going to do with this gallery? Where are we going to go? And so that show, this was curated by Rob Storr. So most of these artists, you know, I just met through Rob. There are big names and big artists, but it wasn't anything that I didn't think that I was going to continue with these artists, but it was the way of opening the door to larger audience. That was the thought behind. Should we do next slide?
Yeah, let's move to the next slide.
So Edna Andrade, amazing lady. She was a mentor to a lot of Philadelphia artists. Highly respected woman who taught at the PCA all her life. Briefly, she was married to an architect who taught at University of Pennsylvania, Andrade. They got divorced some point early in their life, and then they each went on their way. And she said that was the best thing ever happened, because she now has to really focus on her art and not doing any more drafting for the architect, because she used to do a lot of drafting. We all have learned a lot from Edna. We still continue to represent her estate. She did a lot of drawings and the paintings. We do not have many paintings in the estate anymore, but we continue to come up with interesting ideas to carry her legacy. So we're working with her drawings right now, placing some of the drawings in the museum collections, gifting some of them to the museums, and working on the small book on her drawings. Right after she died, we had published a big publication and traveling exhibition, which was a very exciting show. This piece that we're showing right now, since then, it's placed at the Met. It's at the Metropolitan Museum collection. By the way, the other piece, Dorothea Rockburn, piece that we had in back up on the slide. We had it in the Purest Image show. This piece here, we placed it in the Philadelphia collector's home at the time. And I just recently noticed when I was at the Whitney, it was hanging at the Whitney wall. So gifted to the museum as a collection, which is always nice to revisit paintings that you have sold, 30, 40 years ago now, hanging in the museum wall. That was a nice surprise. Moving forward with Edna.
And how did Edna meet Marion? It's a great story.
Right. So Edna, right, that's so. Why don't you tell the story?
Okay, yeah, I can tell. Edna Marion wanted to curate a show of women artists for the gallery and contacted Edna about being in the show, and their first encounter was a refusal from Edna. She didn't want to be in the show, but that refusal led to an ongoing conversation between them, and eventually Edna was in the show. And it's just a fascinating relationship that sort of continued across many years. And Edna was very involved in the public scene in Philadelphia as well, and was responsible for several major commissions there, and is really ingrained in the fabric of the city.
No question. I think Edna at the time kind of did not want it to be categorized as just a woman artist. She herself always considered as an artist of her own rights that could stand up to the guys or whatever, and she did not want it to be especially categorized as a woman artist only. This is very early 70s, just starting to the women's art group just becoming very active. Since then, she was very supportive and helpful, but in the beginning, she was resisting the idea to be just pushed over as a woman artist. And Edna, being a woman artist, taught at the university, very influential, very well established in many ways, and she sold her work well through the gallery. She was highly respected, highly articulate, and she was good friends with Louis Kahn at the time. They were all around the neighborhood. They used to come to her shows and they share their ideas. Important time in a way in Philadelphia. So Edna was always almost like a supporter of Edna, advisor of the art. Marian wanted to pick up a new artist who will always talk to Edna. What do you think of these artists? Or Edna will always recommend certain kind of artists to show. Even till, they're about the same age, even in their late 80s and 90s, they were very close friends. So we honor that relationship. We still carry on their legacy, both of them. It's important to us.
Eleanor, I think if you go to the next slide, we have a slide for Warren Rohr. Yeah. David, I'll let you take over from here.
That's
when I met David Courier for the first time.
One thing we've gone slightly past that I didn't want to lose here is the gallery space itself. The slide, I think it was number 4 we had. Can we go back to that? Because one of the things that was immediately distinctive to me, and particularly I think it's important for people that haven't been there, was the massiveness of the building. It's on the corner of a big open, what's the park there?
Washington Square.
Am I making this up that it had been a bank or it had been?
It was a
publishing
right?
house, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, because
Law and medical publishing house.
It just is a building that if there was an earthquake and everything else was gone, this would survive. It just and I think that's quite important as a critic, because you see, when you talk about the artist here, there was a sense of the permanence and stability. You see, it's at the corner there, it's standalone. And I think, and you come out of the park and the greenery and you come into it, and then you can, I mean, it really, I think those kinds of things are really important for the space.
It is a kind of an important part of history here in Washington Square, very historical square. In the 19th century, this entire square was all publishing houses. Wow. Philadelphia had major publishing houses, and this specific building was dedicated to medical and law journals. So they were still existing and printing books and journals. When we moved in here, they moved to the suburb. But there's a Lipinka, there's a Farm Journal, there's a Curtis. So all these major buildings, except the one building on the corner was an insurance company. Of course, you have to have insurance in the 19th century in any city. But it's interesting, it was mainly all publishing houses, one by one, publishing houses kind of either moved out or closed their business, and we can, so anyway, so that's the history of this building.
And it's how many square feet? It's 3 floors really here.
Yeah, each floor is probably about, I don't know, 5,000 square foot.
Wow. That's, you see, that's just.
And there's a rooftop as well.
Right, you can see it on the top. That's what, there are some sculpture shows that we have done on the rooftop. Maybe we can look at some of those sculpture shows. It
just gives the sense that you're not going to go away.
There's a sculpture show. So we did Linda Bangler's sculpture shows up there.
Yeah.
No,
If you go down towards the bottom, Eleanor, yeah, it's
there.
we passed it.
there's one, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a George Segal sculpture, there's a Nevelson, there's a Brian Hunt on the left. Anyway, let's just go back to the other orders, and then we could probably talk about some of the artists that we have shown since then. So anyway, so we all kind of, and then Marion had kind of retired 89, and then sort of started to really seriously thinking about building our representation here. Over the years, we did, I don't know, about 20 some exhibitions of Jennifer Bartlett shows. And then we did about at least a dozen to 15 catalogs over the years. So we got to meet a lot of writers who were interested in Jennifer's work. We're talking about Warren Rohr. That's how I met David Carrier. So Warren Rohr was a Philadelphia artist. This show, when we had invited David, we had moved to this new building. We realized in our old space we had a lot of limits because the entrance was very small and, you know, other reasons. Plus, I wanted to be close to my children. So for selfish reasons, I wanted to be on Washington Square. So this, you know, building helped us to do the programming in many ways. So Warren Rohr was also teaching at the PCA at the time, Philadelphia College of Art, since it became a university, but very serious, committed painter who did interesting work, dedicated teacher. I don't know how many shows we did. We did many shows with him as well, still 18 shows.
And Warren, you know, you've been on the NSE before to talk about Warren's work. And one of the things you mentioned was the small but very avid group of collectors that were very important to Warren in the area at the time.
Yes, so people like Dan Dietrich was a big dedicated collector and supporter. There are few people. It's, as you can see in the image, it's a very hard work to sell it through the pictures or the transparencies. It's, you really have to see it in person, face to face. And even the catalogs was a struggle because the colors don't always come through, they're not always correct. So people who kind of tend to see the work and more moved by it than, you know, through the catalog. But he was showing actively 80s and 90s in New York. And then slowly he just kind of retired back to Philadelphia, kind of lost interest in New York art scene. So we started to represent him more exclusively since then, 2000 on. But he kept the galleries in New York. So it's well shown in New York as well. So
part of him was very interesting because for all of the resistance, I mean, here, the Mennonite community, which was ambivalent about him as an artist, that he chose to stay there and not to move away. I mean, he could have, if he'd moved 100 miles, he would have been completely in another place. But it's very interesting. Do you have any sense of that psychologically? He was.
Oh yeah, he definitely disconnect his relationship with the Mennonites. Both him and his wife is a poet as well. So a poet and a painter, they walk away from that, you know, religious life and dedicated to artist life and poetry. And they moved to Philadelphia eventually and taught at the university and just making art. And he was struggling with his health for a very long time. And so he didn't have any energy to waste. So his entire energy was going into his painting and his teaching, very dedicated life. Should we move on to the next artist?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thomas Chimes. You worked with Thomas Chimes for many years, and Thomas also worked in New York, but then came back to Philadelphia. And I see Michael Taylor in the audience, who has interviewed Thomas Chimes for a documentary and has curated Thomas's work. So it's nice to see you, Michael. But yeah, tell us about the process of working with Thomas and Thomas is an example, one of many examples of the gallery working with an artist over a very extended period of time and getting to watch them work in unique ways. I think Thomas had 5 sort of distinct periods of his work that the gallery talks about, but I'm curious to hear you speak to that, especially having developed that long-term relationship with him as an artist.
Tom was a very special artist in many ways, lived very simple life, very dedicated to his books and his art and his thoughts, well-read, but very focused. Started out as a kind of, living in New York City, influenced by what was going on at the time, 50s, and looking at some of the surrealists and actually seeing their exhibitions, and then starting to see this abstract expressionist movement coming in. He was midst of all of that. But he served in US Navy, Air Force. Interesting career in the life. And then with that, he went to school in New York. He did not really feel comfortable in New York. He didn't feel he belonged in New York. He didn't feel that he belonged to all that scene that was going on, abstract expressionists and all that. So they moved back to Philadelphia, where he was born and raised originally, and decided that he was going to find his own way to make art, not the movement that's dominant at the time in New York. He knew he couldn't survive as an artist unless part of that movement. So Philadelphia gave him a kind of a space to work and live. And luckily, Philadelphia Museum was his kind of a resource place. He will go to the museum, he will look at all the art, learned a lot, and kind of met Anne Darnacourt at the time. This is like early 60s and 70s. And Darnacourt was a young curator in Philadelphia. They will have endless dialogues about Philadelphia Museum collection, the roles the museums are playing, the curators, especially Duchamp, because Anne Darnacourt was a Duchamp scholar. So they will share a lot of their thoughts with Duchamp, but he still was developing his own idea. This metal box we're showing here, it's called Green Box. So Green Box, the title itself, right away, you think of Duchamp's Green Box. But it's not exactly that. He's always finding his way with his mind in one side, thinking about these artists that was kind of influencing him and also kind of pointing the direction to him and leads the way, but he's always finding his own way. So he made about 30 of these metal boxes. They were all made in his own garage, handmade, welded and filed, sanded down. Not only the images are interesting, where it's coming from, what they are, deeply into all the surrealist ideas and Duchampian ideas and all that, but also the object itself visually is so beautifully made and mesmerizing. And that struck me as an important artist. And he had so much to tell you once you meet him. Of course, somebody like, Michael Taylor opened the door in many ways when they did that retrospective for Tom. So I guess in the very beginning of my gallery career, I met Tom, learned a lot from him, really respected him as an artist, and impressed me how one could dedicate entire life and energy into that channel. Nothing really mattered to him. So his life was about just making art. He lived in a one loft space, and that's all he did. He's just there and working and going to the museums and seeing things, but not really worried about the art world in New York, because he's already left that behind. He's finding his own way. So in the early days, he made these metal boxes. And then he moved on to the next series. So it's a very systematic in a way. He stayed with these metal boxes once he's done. Let's see if we can see the next slides of the 70s. He's moved on to
Panels.
Yeah, now he's into Alfred Jarry. So he's reading all this French literature and avant-garde movement in France in the 19th century. All these intellectuals kind of beginning of the modern art. So he's going right into the roots of modern art and thinking what am I going to really do? What am I going to make? So he's done with the metal boxes, whatever he was doing over there. It's a lot to talk about. I can't really get into the whole detail. There's a lot in our website that talks about all his ideas. And then he gets into this whole working from old photographs. He's making his own objects. These frames are all his own ideas of the frames, kind of framing these figures that he most admire and influencing his mind as a kind of a pantheon of his artists. There's a portrait of Alfred Jarry. There's a portrait of Liechtenstein. And then who else? Oh, and then he does the Duchamp's, Rose Salovey portrait. He does about 30 other literature group dark portraits in this kind of a very stark frame. He also clearly was looking at people like Thomas Eakins, who was very prominent in our Philadelphia Museum collection, has his heavy wooden frames of 19th century, but he's kind of, he made all these frames himself in his garage as well. So he's making these objects on his own, but thinking about other people who lived prior to, his time, what they have done in the art history, and finding his way of creating. So that path is very interesting and fascinating. Just kind of leaving that New York scene, how he's finding his way through the literature, through whatever his own way, from the metal boxes, the stock portraits. There are about 30 of these portraits, and then he goes into the white portraits. Can we see one of the white, next slides? Is there white portraits in there? No, oh, we missed it. Okay, sorry. Anyway, it's then he gets into this whole another chapter. That's Thomas Chimes.
David may have a question, but I wanted to ask a broad stroke question before we move into some of the work of the other artists that you've worked with. In the case of each of these three artists that we've just talked about, I wondered if you could talk about how the scene in Philadelphia has changed over the past 55 years, and sort of how in your mind, the role of the gallery in supporting artists from Philadelphia has shifted to meet those changes, or if at all, or what you think about that.
It's hard to say. I think, we're so close to New York in many ways. The arts in itself is always, contemporary art especially, was a struggling scene. And we kind of knew from the day one getting into it, Marianne had told me, this is not a business. This is just, me supporting these artists. And she wasn't think of it as a really business. In same sense, I really didn't understand the business either, other than kind of, from my heart, what I knew as who are the good artists. I was kind of going after the art and artists who inspired me, or I felt that they deserved the attention. So the business comes afterwards. So the focus was always, who are the greatest artists? What can I really do with it? And that's always following that step. So really, I wasn't able to change the scene in any way other than focusing on what I could do for my artists, for my art scene. And the schools, Philadelphia always had this good art schools, and a lot of people coming out of this school. And right away, the first thing they do is they all move to Philadelphia. To New York, the graduated. So one of the things that I tried to do from the early on was, how can we keep these artists to stay in Philadelphia and make art? Many different ways we try. But it's always a struggle, as we all know, providing the housing for the artists is tough. And in our early days, we had more maybe artist fellowships and artist grants. Those things always help, but it's on and off. So right now, after COVID, it's very hard. A lot of artists moved from New York to Philadelphia. More artists are living here. But I always felt that this is always biggest issue and complaint of my thing is that we don't have good coverage for the art in Philadelphia. The newspapers were not very helpful. We didn't have enough publications that really helped the coverage. I'm doing my own way, doing the catalogs, but it's reaching very small, specific focused audience, working towards the collectors and working towards the museums or the artists. Changing the scene, I don't know how that helped. I felt like I didn't really help much to make the scene to be more robust to go on in the city. Is that because we're too close to New York? I don't know. But bringing people from New York to here was always my focus, have the people to come and see the show. Through 80s, the very first art fair I did was a Chicago art fair in the 80s, which was a big art show at the time. And the only show in town really was. So through that, we developed some more national audience and realized we have to broaden even more from there. So the art fairs in the 80s and then 90s, the Switzerland, Basel, we did it once or twice. That helped, just, building the audience through bigger market. Philadelphia art scene, I think when the museum curators are interested in the local artists, it helps a lot more. And Darnell days were very different. We were kind of lucky, some of these artists, and she was very committed curator who also carried on as a museum director supporting these artists. And depends who's doing the ICA shows. When the directors and curators are putting more effort to the local scene, you can see the difference. There's a big movement of trying to set up and going this Philadelphia Contemporary Harry Philbrick's working on. There's ICA, there's a Pennsylvania Academy, there's some local spaces. But we do not have enough coverage to get information about what's going on. Like in New York. New York, you have a lot of different ways to learn what's happening. So what do you hear about Philadelphia? We're sitting in New York. Brooklyn Rail's been great. We get good coverage with the Brooklyn Rails in a way.
Is that what you do have in Philadelphia in the modernist collection is a very distinctive view that's unlike New York. All of that Duchamp material, there's nothing like that in New York. Of Brancusi and that whole selection.
Right, it's a great museum, yes.
So, I mean, you really get it quite, and I would think of more if you look at some of the expressionist painters, and then, of course, now with the Barnes, I mean, you really get quite a different view of modernism. If someone grew up in New York, if someone grew up in Philadelphia and couldn't go to New York, she would have quite a different view of the early 20th century, don't you think? Quite a different.
Oh yeah, it's a museum was a big influence for a lot of these artists, especially my artists, no question. It was like a center to hang out and see things. And over the years, we have shown a lot of other artists as well, but now kind of I'm narrowing it down, my focus a little bit more is a Bartlett. Let's move on to our next slide so we can show some of our artists. That's another Jennifer Bartlett's, one of the 20 shows we did, I guess, is in the garden series that we have shown. So Bartlett was another woman who really taught me a lot, and I kind of understood more about the artist's life in a way. Tom Chimes was very internally torn and, searching for himself. And there's different ways to go about with the artist. And with the Jennifer, I learned totally different things. With the Linda Banglers here in our roof was another artist. I mean, all these artists really taught me a lot about their art practice and their life in a way. To me, their personality and their art, their life is all connected. So when I meet the artists, if I couldn't get connected with them, I couldn't possibly represent them in any way. So it was my, guiding light was always about that, having these artists, meeting them and connecting with them and understand what they're really doing and what I really want to do and be involved with them in what way. So here's a Banglers exhibition that I arranged to do in Miami, during Miami Basel, when they first started in the beginning of Miami Basel. I planned this show at the Bass Museum. There's a Linda and I'm sitting after installing that piece. It was quite a struggle, fountain piece. You know, as we all know, Linda was very obsessed with the fountains. And myself as an artist, early on in my, you know, artist days, when I lived in Italy, I was so fascinated by water fountains in all over the city, how wonderful they were. So I share that whole obsession with Linda, and no New York galleries wanted to show any of these fountain pieces. It's so cumbersome, it's impossible to show and all that. And so I was trying to figure out the way, where can we show these fountains? So we showed it on our roof, we showed it in Miami. So it was kind of a fun and arranging shows. We did another show in Dublin, actually. That was also a fun show, and installed the fountain pieces as well with Linda. Oh, and here's another show that I did in the 90s with the Louise Bourgeois when she was alive. Meeting all these artists, you know, again, she was already in her late career. But these personage series that this is not from that show that I did. This is actually the group show much later. One person show I did with the Louise Bourgeois. Somehow, I guess Andrew couldn't find the install shots. Were all cast of the original her 1940s pieces of a personage pieces. She had done about, I don't know, 20 of them. Was a pretty impressive and wonderful show. Through that, I was able to arrange an exhibition in Korea. So we did a Louise Bourgeois exhibition in Korea. So actually, going back, you know, my memory now brings back in the 90s, I was doing a lot of shows in Korea, museum shows. So Louise Bourgeois show was one, and I did a Louise Nevelson show in Korea. So I was just starting to connect it, this, you know, elderly women artists who had worked all their life and sitting there listening to their life stories and their work. And I was very moved and impressed by their work. Anyway, she became, you know, very big and famous, and I couldn't go near there anymore. But the early on, it was really special experience sitting there in her studio and talking to her and watching her doing the watercolors and drawings and those shows. Those are the early on shows. As you can see on our slides, we had a lot of, and then Nancy Graves is another artist that I did through David Bourdon. Forgot about all this, you know, interesting memories. David Bourdon introduced Nancy Graves to the gallery and did a show. Do we have a Nancy Graves slide somewhere? Can we scroll down Nancy's work as well? There it is. That's much later show, but so, you know, Nancy was a pretty big figure in the 80s when I first came in the scene. So did a number of shows, and I still continue to work with the Graves Foundation doing the work. She was very intelligent, very specific in many ways. What are the slides we have now? Well, these are 70s painting shows we did. Oh, now we're getting into Jane Irish. Anybody had a comment on the Nancy Graves or anything added on? And then we can go on to Jane Irish, I guess. Jane Irish is another Philadelphia artist. That project was done at Lemon Hill, which is a very historical building on the river here near Philadelphia Museum. Was commissioned by Philadelphia Contemporary. There's a Jane standing in the middle of the room. The building is basically was a country house at the time. It built as a country house, 2 oval rooms on top of each other. Interesting architecture. So was that Kimball who lived in that building? I think no, it was not a Kimball. Another museum director of a Philadelphia museum actually lived in building and kind of restore the building. And he was able to look at the museum across the river, so he could watch the museum building for living there. But the since then building was kind of deteriorated. They were trying to revive the building. The Philadelphia Contemporary was able to arrange this exhibition. So Jane was all in for the building, really, did the whole installation for the entire wall murals and the ceiling for both floors of the oval room.
They were antipodes, right?
Yeah.
Hemispheric opposites.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Through that, she was actually introduced to Princeton Museum curators and the directors, and they're actually commissioning her to do the ceiling painting for Princeton Museum's new building, which is pretty exciting for Jane. So these are some of Jane's early works. David, you have seen some of Jane's work, I'm sure, from the gallery, no? Jane Irish?
Those, yeah, they're wonderful paintings. I don't remember which, oh, sorry, I can't. But now you make me want to.
Who else do we have in a slide? Oh, it's a Sarah McEnany, another Philadelphia-based artist. It's a rail park. She's an activist from the very beginning to get the rail park going. When the New York rail park was starting, she wanted to do the Philadelphia rail park. So the partially open now, and she's part of that. She's still very involved with the rail park as a board member and fundraiser. And she did a whole series of paintings of the rail park. Do we have more slides on Sarah? Oh, here's a Sarah, her studio. There she is laying down with her cat sitting on the sofa, and that's her studio in her garden outside. Another Philadelphia artist that we've been working with. That's another group show, one of the artists that we've shown, Robert Motherwell show from the 80s. That's, oh, Alice Neal, wow. Alice Neal, I didn't know who she was. And Donalcourt kind of introduced me and said, oh, Sueyun, you should do, Alice Neal show. She's a Philadelphian. So I said, yeah. And then we got into it and got very excited about the work. By then, she had already passed away. And Philadelphia Museum was thinking about doing a Neal show. So during that show, we did a really wonderful, incredible Alice Neal show with the catalog.
Can you tell us a little bit about the role the catalogs play in coinciding with the exhibitions? Because the gallery has really published so much.
Yes, that was a very important part of our work here. We're very small staff here, and I'm very, grateful to all the gallery staff who worked here over the years, went on with their career at the museums in different parts. But through the catalog, and also my whole idea of catalog was, I didn't just send it out to the designers to do the catalog outside. It was always in-house project. So we learn, putting the book together, we learn about the artists, we learn about what they have done in the past, what kind of works they did. So it's like in a way, for us to think about the artists, think about their work, their career, their legacy, everything about their arts. By producing the catalog in-house, in-house meetings and designing it together, it's a process. And then once that's done, and we kind of now focus on sending it out to the people that will listen to us in a way, whether they are the collectors, they are the museums or the critics, and then the mailing out, all that done in-house. I don't send it out to the mail house to mail anything. Everything, it's all homemade here. So designing the show to making the catalogs to, and we learn a lot from that experience. It's very important to us about these projects. And I don't know how many catalogs we have done over the years, maybe hundreds. But now we don't know what to do with them. We have a lot of them still piled up, but it's our pleasure working with that.
What we're looking at right now is a commission that Pat Steer did at the Barnes Foundation.
Oh, yes, that was, amazing show as well. Yeah.
And that was after the Barnes Foundation moved to City Center after being out in the suburbs.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that something that consistently comes through, excuse me, in the slides here is the way that you have room for the art to breathe. you really have a great luxurious sense of the space. And that's really important, particularly for these bigger works. It's wonderful that way.
Well, we have the Pat Steer show up right now. So behind me is the Pat's exhibition that you couldn't see.
Wow, oh yeah, sure.
And do we have more slides? I have no idea what's still in the back to kind of go through.
Yeah, I believe we have some amazing images of Frank Stella.
Oh,
Here we go.
yes.
In 2006.
2006. That was pretty ambitious show. That piece was installed downstairs, first floor gallery. And then if you flick, that's a second floor space. He totally changed our gallery space, not only just his work, and he actually hung those pieces on the column of the gallery. He wraps our concrete column with the steel plates and hung his bronze cast paintings. Hung it, and most of those pieces are just enormous, huge pieces and heavy. We have amazing photographs of the installing. And oh, here's another view of that big paintings. And I just totally forget how we got even started with the Frank Stella. It could have been Princeton connection, maybe. Who connected us with the Frank Stella? I don't remember, but he was an amazing artist. And he just, once he was involved, I had nothing to do with it. He took over the whole building, all 3 floors. He did a different show. The first floor was a total installation show that there's no one piece. It's just an installation site. It was amazing. And the second floor was those bronze pieces he hung. And then this was a 3rd floor space with some small sculptures on huge stainless steel plate showing. So that was another kind of eye-opening, impressive exhibition for me, that I learned how the artist has a vision of the space and their work, how they want to show their work. Oh, Betty Woodman, dear Betty Woodman, that was another amazing artist. Energy Ball, we learned a lot. We learned a lot about clay, a lot about installations. Visited her in Italy where she was living and working. We didn't do that many shows, but I think we probably did 2 shows. I don't know whether we have more slides of the Betty Woodman. Do we have another? No.
I think we just have this one.
Yeah.
And this is where we end.
Another group show with the Polly Applebaum on the floor. We placed that piece to a Pittsburgh museum, I believe. That was an interesting show as well. Polly was also being Philadelphian. So we were always looking for, Philadelphia connection, like Alice Neal was a Philadelphia artist. Polly Applebaum was a Philadelphia born artist. Pat Steer, who was outside of Philadelphia, New Jersey, who lived out there and used Philadelphia Museum as her kind of playground, basically, and learned all about art. So those artists are all important. We are connecting with the Philadelphia, with the New York art. So this was a group show. What else do we have in the next?
I think that's where we end with
Good.
this.
So though, do you have more questions, Chloe? Or you learned a lot about our gallery. Now you know more about the gallery than I do. I'm like forgetting all this memory lane for me.
No, it's such a fascinating history. I guess I would ask, my closing question to you would be about supporting women artists, because you've dedicated a lot of time and effort to supporting female artists across your career. And I wonder if you have anything you'd want to say about that, that specifically in the context of.
As you can see, in the beginning, I really did not know, what I was doing. I was exploring, I was learning, and gradually, I think it just kind of, built up. I mean, these women artists, to me at the time, I was amazed to find Linda Bengler's, all those amazing historical works that she had, but the market wasn't there. None of those pieces were in the museum collections. None of those pieces were sold. And it was mind-blowing to me to learn that. So busy placing those pieces in the museums and kind of connecting with these women artists, because I realized already by 90s, still, a lot of these women artists were not in museum collections. And when I'm knocking on the door to the museums, they were actually listening. They were saying, yes, you're right. We don't have any of those artists in our collection. And then it's just, and also because my admiration of these women who are actually making this art and building their life was so impressive, which I kind of, in a way, that along the way gave up on my art and focusing on the gallery and finding these women artists. It was very rewarding, and they taught me a lot. And more, it's not that I started out that I'm just going to represent the women artists. It just happened naturally. When I turned around and look back, it just happened. All my artists were women artists. Like some people will start to say something like, you can't get into Locks Gallery unless you're that male or the women artist. And when I saw that comment, I said, oh my gosh, I looked at it and realized really all women. And then the male artists that we used to represent from basically early on from the Marion's days, they're gone. It's been decades now, 10 years and whatever. It was very rewarding to work with these women artists and learned a lot, not only just the art and the life, everything about it is amazing.
David, do you have a last question before we turn it over, audience?
Great story. I hope so. You'll find a way to write it out, because it seems to me it's a real important part of an American record. I mean, both the artists and also the context of what it is to have that kind of gallery. I mean, when I look back, I mean, maybe I'm obsessed with that, but I'm just fascinated with the kind of self-confidence it must have taken to say you're going to have a gallery in that big building. Whoa, that was impressive. Because I think that affects everyone. Am I making up the doors when you come in the doors? Those doors it's massive.
David, you have no idea. My choice was either you go to New York and compete and be nobody, or I want to stay here and do something that somebody will listen to me, right? Going to New York at the time wasn't a choice with the 4 little children, and wasn't the place. And we are from Philadelphia. We have all these Philadelphia artists. How can we make it work? Was my focus.
Very impressive. Very impressive.
Thank you so much, Chloe and David and Sueyun. This has been such an incredible and inspiring conversation, and so special for us to hear about what's going on in Philadelphia. We do have a couple questions, and if anyone else would like to ask a question, please raise your hand or send a message in the chat. Our first question will be from our friend GE.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you, Chloe and Sueyun and David. The gallery was important to me even as a 10-year-old going there in 1969 at the original location on Chestnut
Street. Yeah, Chestnut Street. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, Chestnut, but before Walnut. Yeah. So anyway, apart from the press not really dropping the ball, we need a Philadelphia Brooklyn Rail. But anyway,
we do.
Does Philadelphia have a legacy of making art accessible, do you think, in general?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a huge history and a lot more work to be done. There are people like Sid Sachs at the U Arch trying to do some of the Philadelphia scene, and he's a walking history of Philadelphia in a way. And there are a lot of artists live. I mean, and Thomas Eakins stays still on. Pennsylvania Academy played a big role, and PCA, Philadelphia College of Art, and Tyler School of Art. All these artists, the amazing history here. Whether they were all able to make a living here, don't know. It's a tough. We still need a lot more help for the artists, in terms of housing, their coverage, everything. So I thank, Brooklyn Rail paying attention to Philadelphia. Totally.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, GE, for that question. I would like to ask a question to you, Sueyun. I'm curious, just to go way back to the beginning. How did you, or what brought you to gallery and curatorial work in the first place?
Oh, so I was a practicing artist and teaching. And then when I moved to Philadelphia, I got married and had all these children. And my mother-in-law, Marion, had this gallery since '68. And I moved to Philadelphia around early '80s. And my husband was an only son of Marion, was in a way silent partner to Marion. He was a very devoted son who really wanted his mother to, enjoy her life with the art and gallery. So he was it was a very important collector for her in a way. Whenever she had a cash flow problems, didn't have money, he will come in and buy the art to help them out and that kind of thing. So in mid '80s, when Marion wasn't sure what she was going to do with the gallery, she had some health issues and wanted to close the gallery or merge with somebody. So my husband at the time, gently kind of asked me whether I will go sit in with her and kind of talk to her about it. So I just had my babies. I think my girls were like, very young age, infants, basically. So I started going in there and kind of, here and there a couple of days and sit in and talk to her and just watch the scene, be supportive for a few years until we decided, okay, we will probably continue that legacy. Philadelphia probably needs an art gallery. We could probably do it slightly bigger scale than what she's been running. So made that commitment. So we knew we had to move the gallery from, because a few times that we couldn't carry the art up to the second floor, we knew we were limited. So we were looking for a space to move. And when this, building became available, it was natural to us. The only concern was it's not a foot traffic area. It was just convenient for me, close to the house, and has a lot of space that we can do the work. So my whole intention was always that we have to do the work and people have to come to us. So the space was important for the people, the New York artists or Philadelphia artists want to come in and see the space and they want to show here. So early days of the, late '80s, the '90s was a pretty impressive commitment at the time. So that's how we started.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Again, this has been a really incredible conversation, and I'm so happy to have learned so much. And I know that Fong is occupied at the moment, but sends his deepest gratitude to you, Sueyun, for your generous offerings today, and sends his greetings to everybody. And we do now have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome Kelly Corinda to the stage. Kelly is a poet who lives in Brooklyn. She is a graduate of the MFA program in poetry at Brooklyn College, where she worked as a contributing editor for the Brooklyn Review. Her most recent work can be found in the Journal of New Jersey Poets, where it was nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and she is also a registered nurse. And thank you for being here today, Kelly.
Hi, thank you so much. It was great hearing all of you. I'm just going to read a couple poems to close us out. Okay. So the first one's Wild Hunt. Join the cavalcade of aloe, slow creep of glass across a century and a half. Before an assembly of figurines, I would demand offerings of privacy, demand to be left alone to weed in my windbreaker at El Paso Christmas. I put a wreath on the head of a mare, leave the tale, its mimicry and telling to others. Lifestyle shift is a medicine I'm connected with. One slip flips wrath to air. Okay, and then the next one is The Lady of Watermelon Canyon. Her mind she constructed in a hollow diamond, so delicate she laced her boots with it. When turned in the sun, writing scrawls on adobe walls, its prism is devotional, devoted, dove-coated, dovetailed, white-tailed, hiding from horned deer and pickup trucks, eating hatch peppers on hilltops. The fact is the pattern. When you turn it, you become unblind to the methodical geometry of sticks and stones that never hurt, never break, her car smothered with suds, thinning out the chromatic problems, thinning out the chromatic problems, reclined on a mesa top with a rose blanket in hand, murmuring, if you start at the top of the sky and roll it down to the horizon, then all will be tucked in fine. But first the diamond has to turn, has to measure with one cut side, how far the distance is in tumbled increments. My mother posed by a color in a museum. This blue, Emily, it makes me feel calm. Okay. And maybe just two more. Okay, so this is Pentimenti. She learned a new use for her old clothes. She wore them, heel spinning and phenomenal in atoms of sunlight. Took refuge in tangerine trees, ate cinders of paradisiacal pink burned off in an evening when the sun bundled up its hair to sleep. She chose a road and bitted a numinous teeth, a coupe ideal. All pretend as seen against an open window with the voltage of a mirage. The collie that herds the sun advised bilingual sheep to sleep together, fluffed in impervious clusters. They murmured to themselves, first in one language, then another. First comes chaos, then comes earth. First chaos, then earth, then sheep. She pulled silver pajamas over sweaty arms, charged a mural to 365 jewels, tore it apart in a dog-like mind. Okay, and I'll do one more. This is Leonora. The horse dreamt of growing dendriform, of cake covered in marzipan pears. Do horses get fevers? I Googled at the ranch. Insects sucked sap out the windows. Should I lead the horse into the crystal cold creek I walked across up to my thighs and back to visit the arrowheads in the adjacent grass? The horse, I'm sure, is dreaming more than 100 riddles about living in a poisonous world. Eyes closed, it sees mounds of seaweed, sees itself walk through the ranch door to lay on the goldenrod rug. Fever is not dangerous unless extremely high. I call the vet to object when the horse tells me she has seen uncountable eagles fly, that a metallic music rings through their feathers in the wind, and she is irreverent, wild, wide-eyed. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Those were so stunning. I'm so grateful for your reading today. And a huge thanks again to Sueyun, Chloe, and David. And we would also like to send our gratitude to Andrew from Locks Gallery for all of the support in preparing for today's event. And thank you to the Terra Foundation for sponsoring this NSE program to make these daily conversations possible, and for supporting our growing archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for arts, culture, and politics in our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail, and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for 12 p.m. Actually, join us tomorrow at 12 p.m. for a conversation with Stuart Comer, Michelle Kuo, and Charlotte Kent on the event of Signals, How Video Transformed the World at MoMA. And tomorrow we will conclude with a reading by Alyssa Moore. And you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all again for being here today.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Chloe.
you so much.
Thank you, David. Thank you,
It was-
Sueyun.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Sueyun. Many
Thank
happy
you.
memories.
Thank
All
you.
those great shows at Locks.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank
Hi, Jane.